Hi everyone, this is chapter 3 overview, and so let's go ahead and get started. This chapter focuses on what is being called the new urban sociology and gives the background of some of the earlier theorists upon whose work this new urban sociology is based, and it's an integrated view that the authors of the text take. And so one of the key ideas when we think about urban sociology and urban spaces is the importance of the political economy. And the political economy, of course, is recognizing that you don't just have an economic system where goods are produced and sold, services are performed and paid for, but you also have the economy influenced by the relationship to government, to the policies that government makes, and of course laws that are created by government that may impact the economy. And so essentially, political economy recognizes that there is a interdependence, a link between the economy as well as the political system, and those two things may influence one or the other. There's a focus on some of the early theorists, Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, Karl Marx, Max Weber, and Engels, Frederick Engels. And some of their work, of course, is the basis for this new integrated view. But very quickly, of course, just as a summary, Marx, of course, as you know, wrote about capitalism and what he was seeing during his lifetime in terms of how capitalism was affecting not just the economy, but also the people who were part of that economy, the workers. And of course, for Marx, the workers, of course, had one experience at the workplace, but then, of course, that extended to their living conditions. Where did they live? How did they live? What was their life like outside of work? Weber also observed that while the city develops because of its political powers, the independence of the city residents and their local government are different from those of the feudal relations of authority. And the feudal relationships would have been back when people worked land and the land was not owned by them, it was owned by some feudal person, a lord, who these workers then either paid a sum of money for the use of the land, or they gave part of their crops, however people paid their fees back then. And so for both Marx and Weber, when they looked at whether it was a system of feudalism or whether it was capitalism, what they found was that the way that work is done and the social relationships that are created within that spatial form, whether it's the feudal society where people are largely agricultural and perhaps bartering with each other, but then also having to pay the feudal lord some fee for the use of the land that they didn't own but were using, and then looking at how the spatial form, how the space was used under that system, and comparing it with how under a burgeoning capitalist system space was being used, not just in the workplace but then also outside of work. Frederick Engels, who was a colleague of Karl Marx, did focus a little bit differently in terms of capitalism. He recognized that there was what he called a double tendency of concentration, meaning that within urban areas there seemed to be a lot of concentration of capital investment or money, but also a lot of workers in those spaces. And of course, as we all can figure out, the reason for that would have been because that's where factories were, textile mills, etc. And so if you've got an influx of money coming into a city, to an urban area, and the building of factories, then of course you're going to have a number of workers who come to the city so that they can then work in these spaces. For urban sociologists, there is a focus as well on contemporary urban sociologists. There's a focus as well on uneven development. That is, when you look at an urban space, let's just think about the city of LA. And the city of LA is quite large. Any zip code that has 900 is part of the city of LA. And so it stretches from the middle of the center of LA to all the way west, out to Larchmont Village and West LA, and then of course all the way east out to City Terrace and Boyle Heights, etc. And then of course it goes out to the San Fernando Valley, including parts of areas near Reseda and Tarzana, places like that. So it's a huge metropolitan area. And when you look at that large metropolitan area that we call Los Angeles, it's very clear that the city has been developed unevenly. You know that there are parts of the city of LA that are quite wealthy, the west part of LA, for example, but you also know that there are parts of the city that are much less developed. And so, of course, we look to the east side for that. City Terrace, Boyle Heights, East LA, etc. And then, of course, there's everything in between in terms of the development and the distribution of people across the city as well, which of course means that we can also see a segregation of social classes within this uneven development of the city of Los Angeles. Two types of capital are identified by urban sociologists. The primary circuit of capital, and then of course the secondary circuit of capital. And the primary circuit, of course, is where you see the factories, you see the, well, we don't really have textile mills so much anymore, but you see the factories, you see the places where goods are produced, you see that's where people work. Things are produced, whether it's in the garment industry in downtown LA, or in the flower mart near downtown LA, or in the produce market, etc. The secondary circuit of capital, that is where there's investment in real estate. And this investment is primarily to generate the profits and bring in additional capital. So you can think about LA Live and the Staples Center as being part of that secondary circuit of capital. And I see that's a typo there. I should say circuit of capital. So places such as LA Live, Staples Center, some of those large hotels that have been added in the last 5 to 10 years in LA, that's part of that secondary circuit of capital. We also see the idea of abstract space in this chapter, as well as social space. And these are, I know I'm going to say his name incorrectly. It's a French name. My French is not good. I know very little. Lefebvre's term, abstract space, was for understanding the qualities of space, including the physical dimensions, the profit opportunities, the policy options. When we think about space, whether it's an open field or it's a high-rise commercial building, that we think about that space abstractly in terms of thinking about the space that is housed there. In that, say, that commercial building, we think about what are the physical dimensions? How many floors does it have? How many offices are there? Are these offices used by lawyers or doctors or by bankers, etc.? And does this office building make money for the person who or the group that owns it? The social space is really focused on how do people who live in urban space, how do they use their surroundings. Are there parks? Are there skate parks? Are there cafes? Are there closed streets where there are farmers markets? What's going on in the social spaces that people use outside of work? Okay, so let's focus on this socio-spatial perspective that is introduced in this chapter. And it is inspired not only by those early sociologists and thinkers, Marx, Engels, and Weber, but also by that French sociologist slash philosopher Lefebvre. His ideas also are integrated in this socio-spatial perspective. So it really is understanding that the way that people use their space has a lot of interdependence in terms of the political economy, which includes the local governance of that urban area, the cultural orientations of the residents, and then the forces of the global economy that shape social life across a metropolitan region. And so if we think again about metropolitan LA, what we can think about is the political economy. What kind of economy does LA have? Well, certainly it has tourism. Lots of people come to Hollywood to sightsee, etc. Certainly it has banking, it has industry, it has technology, but it also has quite a good deal of um, uh, everyday life services, so things like restaurants and movie theaters and parks, etc. All of that is part of the urban space, that socio-spatial perspective. And of course, the global economy does also shape our social life. So again, if you think about LA, consider how what's going on in Ukraine with Russia having invaded in late March, and consider how that global occurrence is impacting or affecting supply chains perhaps, or the price of gas. Think about how the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still with us, how that has affected the global economy, where people travel or why they may not travel, etc. All of that is part of this socio-spatial perspective. And of course, the push and pull factors that we discussed in the chapters for the first week, looking at what are the factors that keep somebody where they are or push them to go into a different urban area perhaps, as well as how is real estate developed. We tend to, again, going back to LA is such a great example, and one that fortunately many of you are familiar with. You think about how currently there's a race for this in the city of LA for mayor. The current mayor is being termed out, Eric Garcetti, and so the top two contenders in the California primary last Tuesday were Karen Bass, a lifelong Democrat. She's been active in California politics for many years, and Rick Caruso, who only recently changed his political affiliation to Democrat so that he could run as a Democrat for the LA mayor's race. He is a businessman, quite wealthy. He's developed quite a few places that are well known in Southern California, the Grove on the west side of LA, the Americana brand in Glendale. He's developing one off the 210 at Santa Anita. And so one can wonder, why, as a lifelong Republican, did he suddenly switch his political affiliation? But the reality is that how real estate has been developed by not only Mr. Caruso, but others, has a lot to do with where they think they will make the most money. And so we haven't seen a lot of development in East LA or City Terrace or Boyle Heights, or out in the San Fernando Valley and some of the lower economic areas. And of course, all those cultural factors, including race, and gender, and the the way in which we use our space and how we think about the use of space, who uses parks, who uses open spaces, etc. And then finally, just finishing up here with a discussion of some of the ideas that are presented toward the end of the chapter. This idea of semiotics. Semiotics is referring to the study of language and how symbols and signs have meaning and who creates those meanings. Who decides that this symbol means a particular thing? And typically what we see is that the people who have the most power within a society typically are making those decisions about what a symbol means or what a sign means. Symbols, of course, are things that represent something. So you see, let's see, I'm trying to think of a symbol that's quite prevalent when you're driving. You see a symbol that is a T. Okay, that means there's an intersection coming up ahead. No one has to spell it out for you. You just see that cross, black cross on a yellow sign. You know, okay, I'm coming up to an intersection. Usually we'll see this when you're on a 2-lane highway or something. That symbol, the symbol red in a traffic signal, why does that mean stop? The symbol green, a green light in a traffic signal, why does that mean green? So semiotics is studying all of that. A sign, we see signs around us all the time. When you go to the bathroom, you look for that symbol that is a blue circle, typically a blue circle with a white figure on it. That's a sign. It's a mental image that comes from your ability to identify the signifier, which is the word or the object or the gesture, and the signified, the cultural meaning attached to that word or that symbol or that object. And finally, theming. This is a brief paper assignment I've given you for this chapter. Thinking about theming and how Godinger identified it back in 2001. This idea that we see an increased use, and remember, Godinger came up with this in 2001, but I think it's probably even more true today, where we see this use of signs and branding to sell certain experiences and to build up an environment via some sort of cultural motif or cultural signage. So we think about Hard Rock Cafe. Okay, many people will eat at a Hard Rock Cafe, say in Universal City, and why do they eat there? Because they know it's owned by a rocker, an old rocker, but a rocker, or a Margaritaville in Florida or some other resort area. Why do people go to Margaritaville? You can get a margarita at any bar, but there's some sort of experience that they're expecting. And in particular, think about Las Vegas casinos. There are so many casinos in Las Vegas that are selling a theme. There's okay, well, I don't know them all, even though I live very close to them, but many of them have a theme, right? It might be the Eiffel Tower theme. It might be there's one, the Italy one. There's one where it's supposed to look like Venice. I don't know, you'll have to look them up. But again, why do people go to these casinos? Why don't they go to the ones that, or believe me, there are plenty of casinos in and around Las Vegas that are not branded as highly. There's a chain here called Dottie's Casinos. It's 24-hour casinos. You never hear about that one. Why? It's not themed as widely as those other casinos. So in the paper, I'm asking you to think about how theming impacts or influences the experiences that you have in your own community. All right, that is it for the chapter.